In the beginning, he was little more than a Utah cowboy. Butch Cassidy became an enduring legend of the American West. It's a story of outlaws riding hard to escape a posse, of rustling and robberies, of gunfights and narrow escapes. It's the story of Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid and the Wild Bunch riding the outlaw trail. It's a love story with elusive and mysterious Etta Place. Significant new information reveals the life of Butch and Sundance on their Argentina ranch and in South America. What really happened to Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid? Did they die in a remote South American village?
This program is made possible by the Utah Travel Council, the George S. and Dolores Doré Eccles Foundation, and the contributing members of KUED.
In many ways, Butch Cassidy seems an unlikely fit for one of the most well-known outlaws of the West. His early years seem uneventful and typical of his times. He was born Robert Leroy Parker on April 13, 1866. He was named after his grandfathers. Both were named Robert. Robert Leroy Parker was oldest of 13 children. He was born to a Utah Mormon family. The family homestead still stands today near Circleville, Utah. His sister Lula wrote of a happy home, filled with laughter. Robert Leroy Parker's parents were Maximilian and Ann Gillis Parker. Maximilian's father, Robert, was from Lancashire, England. He worked in a textile mill. He married Anne Hartley Parker, young Bob's grandmother. The elder Robert was converted to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in England. Robert was beckoned to America. The voyage across the ocean took 6 weeks. The time was 1856. Maximilian was 12 years old. The Parker family traveled to Utah on a Mormon handcart expedition. The handcart expeditions were tormented by tremendous physical labor and treacherous weather. Bob's mother, Ann Gillis, and her family also joined the Mormon religion from their native country of Scotland. They came to America and journeyed to Utah by wagon train. Local historians believe Bob Parker was born in this house in Beaver, Utah. Maximilian carried the mail on horseback. He soon became enamored of Circle Valley, near Beaver. He decided to move his family there. The Sevier River runs with abandon in this beautiful canyon. This is the country Bob Parker knew in his youth. Bill Bettinson is the great-grandnephew of Butch Cassidy. Butch's sister Lula was his great-grandmother.
Butch Cassidy's early years was one of pretty happy, normal childhood. He grew up in a Mormon pioneer home with parents that cared about him. He had 12 brothers and sisters. He had a father that was very soft-spoken and mild-mannered. His mother was very religious and taught him Christian principles. They had a pretty happy time. They weren't rich by any means. They're very poor and had a farm. There was a lot of hard work and that, but had a pretty normal childhood.
Bob was working as a cowboy at some of the area ranches in his early teens. He hired on at the Marshall Ranch near the Circle Valley homestead. According to his sister Lula, Bob met someone who was to become an influence on the young boy. His name was Mike Cassidy. Some considered him an outlaw. The cowboys were adept at small-time rustling and altering brands. Bob Parker appeared to be finding out there were easier ways to make $1 than the long, grueling hours of being a cowboy. He acquired another skill that would define his future. He learned to use a gun. Bob Parker left home when he was 18 years old. The stage may have been set as to his new career. His sister Lula wrote of him riding past the poplar trees he helped his mother plant. The poplars were a Mormon tradition. Robert Leroy Parker rode out of Circleville, Utah, and into history. Harry Longabaugh was to be known as the Sundance Kid. He was born near Philadelphia in the spring of 1867. He was the youngest of 5 children of Josiah and Annie Place Longabaugh.
Sundance had two brothers and 2 sisters, and it was kind of a large family, and they never had much money. My Josiah, Sundance's father, never had a true profession. He was a part-time farmer. He worked on canal boats, but he switched jobs and locations where the family lived every year, and they never owned any real estate. They always just like rented a room or an apartment in a hotel.
Harry was on his way west with his cousins from Illinois while still in his early teens. Harry eventually hooked up with a cattle drive that led him to Miles City, Montana. Harry stole a horse, saddle, and pistol from the 3V Ranch in northeast Wyoming in February 1887. The 3V sat in a beautiful valley of the Belle Fourche River. Harry Longabaugh was brought for trial to Sundance, Wyoming. Sundance sits near the shadow of the famous landmark, the Devil's Tower. Harry was 20 years old. He received an 18-month sentence in the Sundance jail. Harry Longabaugh got out of jail on February 5th, 1889. He had a new nickname, the Sundance Kid.
There are a lot of reports about Sundance as being morose. Other reports have him being the best friend and saving the life of a friend. I think what it probably was is shy, and only with his best friends was he comfortable.
The Outlaw Trail is a series of locations in the West. No official trail ever existed. Bob Parker arrived in the mining town of Telluride, Colorado in 1884. He cowboyed at some of the area ranches and worked for the mines. This scenic area is cut by the San Miguel River. It wasn't long before he met another young Utah cowboy. His name was Matt Warner. Telluride, Colorado was flush with money from the booming mining industry. Much of the wealth was stockpiled in the San Miguel Valley Bank. The bank was robbed at gunpoint on June 24, 1889. Historians believe the robbers were Tom McCarty, Matt Warner, Robert Leroy Parker, and a 4th man.
Well, the Telluride bank robbery for Butch Cassidy was really the beginning of his outlaw days, to where he became known and crossed over the line from a small-time wrestler to a known outlaw.
The outlaws started a trend that would characterize their robberies. Fresh relay horses were stashed in a Pony Express style of operation. They would switch to fresh horses as a posse was closing in and make their getaway. Matt Warner described their life on the run in his book, The Last of the Bandit Riders.
We always slept back away from the fire with our backs to trees, rocks, or a bank for defense, and our loaded guns alongside us. If we were raided, we would be shooting in a few seconds from practically concealed cover.
A posse tracked the Telluride robbers to Browns Park near Vernal, Utah. The outlaws split up and escaped. Brown's Park was so remote that it was described as nothing but sagebrush, wild horses, and rattlesnakes. At about this time, Bob Parker takes the alias George Cassidy. Bob Parker becomes George Cassidy. He hires on at the Bassett Ranch in Brown's Park. It's the fall of 1889. He's on the run from the law for the Telluride robbery. Herb and Elizabeth Bassett had 2 daughters named Josie and Ann. They would become 2 of the most attractive young girls in the area. Josie described the young man who would become Butch Cassidy as a big, dumb kid who liked to joke. Bob Parker met a young cowboy about his age. He would figure prominently in his outlaw career. His name was William Ellsworth Lay. Elsie Lay was born in MacArthur, Ohio on November 25, 1868. Josie Bassett once said,
Elsie Lay was the finest gentleman I ever had the pleasure of knowing.
Butch worked a small ranch on Blue Creek near Kaycee, Wyoming. The ranch is near the famous outlaw hideout, Hole in the Wall. The double cabins still exist. Butch probably used the Blue Creek Ranch for rustling horses. Not far from Blue Creek is the Hole in the Wall. Some told of a western outlaw town behind the cliffs. A town never existed. The V in the dramatic red wall allows narrow passage. Rustlers and outlaws used it because of remoteness and secrecy. Behind the red wall is strikingly beautiful Buffalo Canyon. Rustled livestock grazed this lush valley. Butch made an attempt to go straight. This would be a pattern he would repeat. He would commit a crime and then go straight. Then he would return to a life of crime. As the story goes, he worked for a butcher shop in Rock Springs, Wyoming. He may have learned to butcher from his expertise as a rustler. The nickname stuck. He became Butch Cassidy. Butch and a man by the name of Al Hayner were arrested for horse stealing in April 1892. Butch Cassidy, under the name of George Cassidy, was found guilty of stealing a horse. He was sentenced to the Wyoming Territorial Prison in Laramie, beginning July 15, 1894. Butch's mugshot as he entered prison is one of the few authenticated photographs that exist. His birthplace was listed falsely as New York City. Butch was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor. Butch Cassidy was paroled 6 months early on January 19, 1896.
What kind of man was Butch Cassidy? That's an easy question to answer. He was a pretty good guy, whether you consider he was an outlaw or a law-abiding citizen. Almost everybody liked him, had nice things to say about him. They all agreed he had a wonderful sense of humor, was non-violent as outlaws go.
Butch returned to Brown's Park. He renewed friendships with Matt Warner and Elsie Lay. The Jarvie Ranch and Store was run by the Scotsman John Jarvie. It's on a bend of the Green River, not far from Vernal in northeast Utah. The outlaws found Brown's Park attractive. They liked the isolation and proximity to state borders. Only a few passageways led in and out of the park. Butch and his friends came in for supplies. A hidden dugout exists near the store. Albert Speck Williams operated a ferry crossing on the Green River. He reportedly became friends with Butch Cassidy. Speck Williams may have provided Butch with an early warning system when lawmen approached.
The families, I think, tried to help the outlaws out because the outlaws were were kind to them, were friendly to them, and it was probably a good insurance policy that they wouldn't rob from them if they helped them out.
Matt Warner soon found himself jailed in Vernal, Utah. 2 men were killed in a fight over a gold mine. His friend Butch Cassidy tried to help. 3 men rode into Montpelier, Idaho on August 13, 1896. The men probably were Butch Cassidy, Elsie Lay, and another young cowboy named Bub Meeks. The bank was robbed at gunpoint. Bandits took a payroll estimated at over $7,000. The Salt Lake City Herald reports the holdup. The article claims Butch paid Matt Warner's legal fees.
What I like about the Montpelier bank robbery is it shows the loyalty Butch Cassidy had for his friends.
Matt's legal efforts were partially successful. He was convicted of manslaughter rather than murder. Matt Warner got 5 years in the Utah State Prison. Butch went back to the relative safety of Browns Park. Ann Bassett wrote of the outlaws coming to Thanksgiving dinner in 1896. She says they included Butch, Elsie Lay, and others.
Men wore dark suits with white shirts and stiff starched collars. Butch was pouring coffee. Butch could perform such minor jobs as robbing banks and holding up pay trains without the flicker of an eyelash. But serving coffee at a grand party, that was something else.
Butch and Elsie rode for Robber's Roost in southern Utah to lie low. It's near the town of Hanksville, Utah. Elsie married Maud Davis. She and other women may have joined them. Robber's Roost was hard, desolate country. The landscape was barren and unforgiving, with little water. One of their hideouts was near a clear stream. It's known as the Robber's Roost Spring. A maze of ghostly canyons stretched for miles upon stark miles, ending at the horizon. Rustlers and outlaws could easily disappear, as if vanishing illusions. Riders left the roost in April 1897. Their intent was to rob the Castle Gate coal mine near Price, Utah. The riders included Butch Cassidy and Elsie Lay. Castle Gate was a large mining operation with an enticing payroll. History would record a daring daylight robbery at Castle Gate on April 21st, 1897. It was payday at the mine. The payroll arrived by train. Miners were waiting for paychecks. Robbers stole the payroll at gunpoint. $7,000 was stolen. The outlaws cut telegraph wires. They raced for Robber's Roost. Historians believe a loosely organized gang started to form by the summer of 1896. Newspapers had a variety of names for them. The names included the Robber's Roost Gang. They weren't known as the Wild Bunch until later.
The Wild Bunch was less of a gang and more of a confederation, a loose association of outlaws, very few of whom were in the gang together at the same time over the 10 or so years that it operated. And it was never really known as the Wild Bunch. The newspapers called it the Train Robbers Syndicate and Butch's Gang or Harvey Logan's Gang. And it was only until the Pinkertons in the early 1900s gave it the name the Wild Bunch that that name stuck. But by then the gang was gone.
It included Harry Longabaugh, the Sundance Kid. George Flatnose Curry met up with the gang. Harvey Kid Curry Logan was there. Logan was a killer. He and his brother Lonnie were well-known outlaws.
Harvey Logan was one of the key members of the Wild Bunch, probably organized several of their holdups, but is notorious for being the only seriously violent, psychopathic member of the gang, a guy who would take a detour to shoot somebody.
Butch Cassidy had the reputation of never hurting anyone, but now he was associating with a known killer. Outlaws rode into Belle Fourche, South Dakota on June 28, 1897. Belle Fourche means beautiful fork in French. The town was named for the river that runs through it. Suspected members of Cassidy's gang entered the bank. They made off with less than $100. Butch Cassidy may have decided the time was right to allow things to cool down. The place was Alma, New Mexico. Butch Cassidy and Elsie Lay rode into the W.S. Ranch. The ranch was owned by William French. Butch used the name Jim Lowe. Elsie was William McGinnis. Pinkerton detective Charles Siringo described Alma, New Mexico as a store, a saloon, and a pair of dry rotting hitching posts. Rancher William French thought highly of the man he knew as Jim Lowe. He wrote of him driving cattle to the railhead.
The way he handled those poor cattle over that long and dusty trail of nearly 200 miles was a revelation. Frequently, they had to go as much as 75 miles without water, but he never dropped a hoof.
This appears to have been a seemingly tranquil part of Butch Cassidy's life. Was he trying to go straight or just planning the next robbery?
Butch's life in Alma in the late 1890s in New Mexico is a good example of the life cycle of the gang. They didn't hold banks and trains up every few months like Jesse James. They tended to do a robbery and then lay off for a year or so, go work on a ranch, get out of the way, spend the money, and not get caught.
Outlaw gangs looked at trains as easy marks. Historian Richard Patterson describes the method used in the 1870s. The trains were usually halted by loosening a rail, stacking ties or logs on the tracks, or signaling the engineer with a fake emergency. All that changed with the use of dynamite. Robbers stopped Union Pacific's Overland Flyer on June 2, 1899. The location was near Wilcox, Wyoming, north of Laramie. The time was 2:18 a.m. They went to the express car. E.C. Woodcock was ordered to open the door. He refused. Outlaws blew up the car with dynamite. Woodcock was stunned but not seriously hurt. The engineer, W.R. Jones, told of what happened in a telegraph message.
First section number 1 held up a mile west of Wilcox. Express car blown up, contents gone.
Outlaws made off with about $30,000. The robbers split up. One group shot it out with a pursuing posse led by Sheriff Josiah Hazen. The spot was near Teapot Dome, north of Casper, Wyoming. Historian Charles Kelly wrote of what happened. When the firing ceased, the robbers took this opportunity to make their escape to Castle Creek, which was only a short distance below. They waded down this stream for several hundred yards in order to throw the posse off their trail. They left their horses and some of the plunder they had taken from the train. Their horses were caught and were ridden by some of the posse in pursuit of them. Sheriff Hazen was killed in the gunfight. His funeral was a big event in Douglas, Wyoming. The outlaws reached a sheep camp. They were identified as Harvey Kid Curry, Logan, George Flatnose Curry, and Harvey's brother, Lonnie Logan. Historian Richard Patterson quotes professional manhunter Fred Hans on the escape. Hans called it the most remarkable flight in the criminal history of the West.
Butch Cassidy's family was very embarrassed by his criminal career. It was very tough on them, especially his parents and his siblings. His mother's heart was basically broken by the thought of having a son that was an outlaw.
Pinkerton detective Charles Siringo was on the trail of two riders. They were heading for New Mexico. The riders had a string of saddle horses. Money from the Wilcox robbery was tracked to the Alma, New Mexico store. The money was identified from being torn as it was blown out of the safe by dynamite. Butch Cassidy left Alma, New Mexico. train was robbed near Folsom, New Mexico on July 18, 1899. A posse tracked the outlaws. A gunfight took place. Sheriff Edward Farr was killed. Elsie Lay was captured. He was booked under the name William McGinnis. He received a life sentence in October 1899. Lonnie Logan was killed by authorities in Dodson, Missouri in February 1900. Money from the Wilcox train robbery led them to Lonnie Logan. April 1900. A posse led by Sheriff Jesse Tyler of Moab, Utah, was chasing an unknown man near the Green River. A gunfight took place. The outlaw was killed. The man turned out to be flat-nosed George Curry. He had a Pinkerton reward on his head. Sheriff Tyler would later die by the gun of Harvey Kid Curry Logan. Logan's motive may have been to avenge his friend's death. In Salt Lake City, Butch may have been looking for a way out of the outlaw life. Matt Warner and others claimed Butch Cassidy was requesting amnesty from Utah Governor Heber C. Wells. It didn't happen. The date was August 29, 1900. Butch Cassidy was 34 years old. The place was Tipton, Wyoming. The Union Pacific No. 3 from Omaha was stopped by robbers. The express car was blown open with dynamite. The clerk was the same E.C. Woodcock from the previous Wilcox train robbery. Mounted posses were dispatched by Union Pacific. These horse cars allowed lawmen to get to the scene quickly. One of the posses was led by Federal Marshal Joe LaForce from Rollins, Wyoming. Lawmen caught sight of 3 men and a pack horse. They tracked them to a grove of willows near Baggs, Wyoming. The posse could see horses standing. Lawmen slowly approached. Guns were at the ready. The horses were actually spent horses the outlaws had been riding. The outlaws escaped on a fresh relay of horses left before the robbery. Some historians think the outlaws went to the sanctuary of Browns Park. Others believe they headed straight for Winnemucca, Nevada. The date was September 19, 1900. The place was Winnemucca, Nevada. The target was the First National Bank. 3 men rode into the dusty town. They robbed the bank. Some historians believe the 3 men were Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and Will Carver. Others believe Butch Cassidy was not there. The outlaws again got away. They used fresh relays of horses.
Identifying the bandits in the Wild Bunch's various holdups is next to impossible because they were rarely caught in the act, and so you have to depend on eyewitness accounts of a bunch of guys riding horses with bandanas, and so it's pretty difficult to tell exactly who participated in which holdup.
The outlaws arrived in the notorious Hell's Half Acre in Fort Worth, Texas, in November 1900. Historian Donna Ernst reports they stayed at the Maddox Hotel. Hell's Half Acre was a red light district known for its brothels and saloons. 5 outlaws posed for a photograph at the studio of John Schwartz. The Sundance Kid Harry Longabaugh, Will Carver, Ben the Tall Texan Kilpatrick, Harvey Kid Curry Logan, and Butch Cassidy sat for the photographer. The photo proved to be a mistake for the outlaws. Authorities soon discovered it. They had photographic images of each outlaw. The mysterious Etta Place came into the lives of Butch and Sundance. Her real name was most likely Ethel. Sundance used Harry Place as an alias. She became Mrs. Place. Etta likely resulted from a Pinkerton transcribing error.
Sundance and Ethel probably met down in Texas. All indications are that she was from there. She may have been a school teacher, she may have been a prostitute. We wish we knew.
Pinkerton detectives were on their trail. Wanted posters with descriptions and photos were all over the West. Butch and Sundance decided Argentina was the place for a new start. Sundance took Ethel to meet his family in Montclair, Pennsylvania. He told his family of plans for Argentina. He introduced Ethel as his wife. Sundance and Ethel traveled on to New York. Sundance visited Dr. Pierce's health clinic in Buffalo, New York. Some speculate they had venereal disease. Sundance and Ethel registered in Mrs. Taylor's boarding house in New York City on February 1st, 1901. They registered as Mr. and Mrs. Harry Place. Place was Sundance's mother's maiden name. Butch Cassidy joined them in New York. He registered at the boarding house as James Ryan. Butch bought a watch at Tiffany's on February 4th, 1901. He paid $40.10. Butch signed the Tiffany's register as James Ryan. Sundance and Ethel had their photograph taken at the DeYoung Studio on Broadway. The Pinkertons would describe her as about 27 years old, 5 feet 4 inches in height, weighing about 110 pounds. Butch, Sundance, and Ethel left for Argentina by steamship in February 1901. Some argue Butch came later. Historians Ann Meadows and Daniel Buck followed the story to South America. They uncovered documents and photographs which reveal the life of Butch, Sundance, and Ethel.
Why did Butch and Sundance go off to Argentina? Today it seems like a strange place, but in those days it was a well-known cattle center, a lot of interchange between Western cattlemen and Argentine cattlemen. It was known as a place of opportunity. There were ads by Argentine railroads for giving away free land for settlers. There were stories in magazines like the National Geographic. Any one of those reasons could have sparked their odyssey to Argentina.
Butch, Sundance, and Ethel arrived in Buenos Aires by late March 1901, according to Pinkerton files and Argentine documents. A train robbery took place back in the United States on July 3rd, 1901. The location was Wagner, Montana. The robbery was most likely led by Harvey Kid Curry Logan. Butch's family received reports that he may have been at Wagner. Butch registered for land in Buenos Aires on April 2nd, 1902. He used the alias James Ryan. Sundance was Harry A. Place. Pinkerton files show Sundance and Ethel sailing back to the United States. Sundance was evidently having health problems. They returned to Argentina in late summer 1902. The location of their ranch was in southern Argentina. It's near Cholila in the territory of Chubut. The old ranch house still stands in the Cholila Valley. It's in the foothills of the Andes Mountains. This photograph, owned by Sundance's family, shows Butch, Sundance, and Ethel. They are at their Argentina ranch.
In Cholila, they had a 4-room cabin that was very well appointed with horsehair whips on the walls and pictures on the walls and brass lamps. And Ethel was a really good housekeeper, and she kept perfume in all the wash basins in the house.
This photograph shows Butch Cassidy, Sundance, and Ethel at the ranch with a group of people. Butch Cassidy was 36 years old in the summer of 1902. Raúl Sea's father spoke of the outlaws.
Esta gente tenía, en el caso de Ryan,
These people had a particular personal charm. In Ryan's case, he had a rather contagious laugh that he used at very opportune times, at just the right moment. In other words, he was a very likable person. And that was the lasting impression they all left.
Butch wrote a revealing letter to Matilda Davis on August 10, 1902. Matilda Davis was the mother-in-law of his good friend Elsie Lay. He writes in part,
"It will probably surprise you to hear from me away down in this country, but the U.S. was too small for me. The last 2 years I was there, I was restless. I wanted to see more of the world. Another of my uncles died and left $30,000 to our family of 3. So I took my $10,000 and started to see a little more of the world. This part of the country looks so good that I located, and I think for good, for I like the place better every day. I have 300 cattle, 1,500 sheep, and 28 good saddle horses, 2 men to do my work. I am still living in single cussedness, and I sometimes feel very lonely, for I am alone all day, and my neighbors don't amount to anything. I am a long way from civilization. The summers are beautiful, never as warm as there, and grass knee-high everywhere, and lots of good cold mountain water. The winters are very wet and disagreeable."
The letter ends abruptly. What's left of it doesn't reveal a signature. The letter's return address was Cholila, Territory of Chubut, Argentine Republic, South America.
Some of the people were a little taken aback by the fact that they always wore their guns wherever they went. And people commented on the fact that Ethel was as good a rider as Butch and Sundance were.
Pinkerton agent Frank DeMaio was dispatched to South America. He soon found out about the Cholila Ranch. Wanted posters were circulated in Spanish. Argentine authorities were warned of the American outlaws' presence. Sundance and Ethel again traveled to the States in April 1904. They returned to Argentina late in the year. Butch wrote to Daniel Gibbon on February 29, 1904. Gibbon was a friend from nearby Esquel, Argentina.
"Dear friend, I have been laid up with a bad dose of the town disease, and I don't know when I'll be able to ride. But as soon as I am able, I will be down."
He writes a postscript.
"P.S. Place starts for the lake tomorrow to buy bulls."
The letter is signed J.P. Ryan. June 1904. Harvey Kid Curry Logan died facing capture. He robbed a train near Parachute, Colorado. Logan put a bullet into his own head rather than surrender. A major story of the Wild Bunch came to an end with Logan's death. Butch and Sundance may not have been killers, but they rode with one. Logan is photographed with girlfriend and prostitute Annie Rogers. The bank of Rio Gallegos in southern Argentina was robbed by reportedly North American bandits. The date was February 1905. Argentine police suspected Butch and Sundance. Most historians agree they were not at the Rio Gallegos bank robbery. Knowledge they were once again wanted likely caused Butch, Sundance, and Ethel to give up their life in the Cholila Valley. Butch and Sundance sold their Cholila ranch. They left for Chile. In the meadow leading up to the ranch are 2 poplar trees. They seemingly stand guard over the old Argentina homestead. They are much like the ones Butch helped his mother plant at home in Circleville, Utah. Back in Utah, Butch Cassidy's mother died. Annie Parker's heart failed on May 1st, 1905. Butch's sister Lula wrote of her mother's feelings.
"Mother's heart was broken over this wayward son. Her prayers remained unanswered."
The family moved into Circleville after Butch left home. They lived in this red brick 2-story home. Butch and Sundance were on the run in South America.
Several months after they left Argentina, they came back further north, and they held up a bank in a town called Villa Mercedes and got away with about $100,000, $150,000 in cash, and fled towards the Chilean border with several posses in hot pursuit. There were a couple of gun battles along the way, and they were lucky to escape with their lives, but they did.
Ethel Place disappeared into history. She became one of the great unknown mysteries of the West. She simply vanished.
Ethel Place is a very confusing woman because she never existed prior to or after her connection with Sundance Kid. As far as what happened to her, the last we know of her is a letter that Sundance wrote saying that he was returning her to San Francisco sometime during, I believe it was June of 1905, and that information was found by Dan Buck and Ann Meadows. She just disappeared when she hit San Francisco.
Butch and Sundance followed their tradition of going straight after committing a crime. They made their way to Bolivia. By 1906, Butch and Sundance were working at the Concordia tin mine. It's in the central Bolivian Andes, some 75 miles from La Paz. Much of what is known about Butch and Sundance at this time came from Percy Siebert. Siebert was a North American mining engineer. He worked at Concordia. Butch and Sundance used the aliases James Santiago Maxwell and Harry Enrique Brown. According to Siebert, the outlaws eventually befriended him. They revealed their true identities. Siebert described Butch as an exceptionally pleasant and even cultured and charming man. He used good language and was never vulgar. Butch Cassidy was 41 years old. Butch and Sundance took a trip to Santa Cruz, Bolivia. They were possibly looking for another ranch. Butch Cassidy wrote a letter to the boys at Concordia on November 12, 1907. He writes,
"This is a town of 18,000, and 14,000 are females. This is the only place for old fellas like myself. We rented a house, hired a good cook, and are living like gentlemen. If I don't fall down, I will be living here before long."
It is signed J.P. Maxwell. This photograph is reported to be Butch and Sundance. It was taken in the Bolivian Andes about 1907. Butch is riding a mule at far left. Sundance is standing next to his mule in the center. Historians believe their travels led to the mining town of Tupiza in southern Bolivia. Even today, the remoteness of Bolivia is staggering. The journey to Tupiza begins in heavily populated La Paz. The altitude is more than 12,000 feet. It's a 17-hour jeep ride from La Paz to the village of Tupiza. Herds of llamas in large numbers punctuate a striking landscape. The village of Tupiza appears after a long, dusty ride. Tupiza surrounds a dramatic plaza. A statue pays tribute to the legendary Aramayo mining family. The date was November 4th, 1908. The payroll of the Aramayo Mining Company of Tupiza was held up by two reportedly North American bandits. The payroll was transported by an employee of the company named Carlos Pero. His young son and a servant were with him. Pero was walking. The others rode mules. The story is based upon his written testimony as uncovered by historians Daniel Buck and Ann Meadows. Carlos Pero and his companions reached a remote area called Wakawanushka, or Dead Cow Hill. They were confronted by two armed robbers. Letters to Aramayo mine officials have been found by Daniel Buck and Ann Meadows. Carlos Pero described what happened.
At 9:30 in the morning, we encountered two well-armed Yankees who waited for us with their faces covered by bandanas and their rifles ready.
In a separate letter, Carlos Pero goes on to describe,
In a very menacing manner, they ordered my servant Gil Gonzalez and my son Mariano to dismount, having found me following them on foot, and immediately ordered us to hand over the money we were carrying. Then they demanded that I give them our servant's mule, the dark brown named Ermayo, with the Quechisla brand, which is known by all our stable hands in Tipisa.
the robbers released Carlos Pero, his son and servant. 2 men rode into the small village of San Vicente, Bolivia. The date was November 6, 1908. It's at the foot of the Bolivian Andes. The altitude is about 14,500 feet. Today, San Vicente is a jarring 5-hour jeep ride from Tupiza. The 2 men rode mules. Mules were used in high altitude instead of horses. They more easily acclimate to thin air. One of the mules was the Ermayo mule stolen in the robbery. The 2 men stopped for the night. Word of the robbery spread quickly. A company of 3 soldiers and 1 policeman arrived in San Vicente earlier in the day. The 2 men asked the local mayor for food and lodging. The mayor directed one of the villagers to supply a room for them. This photo reportedly shows the patio of the house. Local villagers claim this was the house in San Vicente. Historians believe the original house was torn down. The mayor described the 2 men ordering a supper of sardines and beer. Soldiers entered the house. 1 soldier was immediately shot and killed by the 2 men.
In a brief shootout, maybe lasting 15 minutes or so, ensued, after which the soldiers said they heard 3 withering screams inside the house, and all was quiet. The next morning, they went in the house and found both Butch and Sundance dead.
Eyewitness Remigio Sanchez was a local miner. He testified on the shootout.
The captain entered with a soldier, and then all of us entered and found the smaller gringo stretched out on the floor, dead, with 1 bullet wound in the temple and another in the arm. The taller one was hugging a large ceramic jug that was in the room. He was dead also, with a bullet wound in the forehead and several in the arm.
The Ermayo payroll was found among the dead bandits' belongings. They were well armed.
The Bolivian government did an inquest after the shootout, determined that Sundance had died with a bullet in his forehead, and Butch had died with a bullet in his temple. And they concluded that Butch had shot Sundance and then turned the gun on himself. And there's another report that they extracted from Sundance's head a slug from Butch's revolver. So the conclusion is that they wounded, lost, sick, surrounded. Butch shot Sundance and then killed himself.
The idea of Butch being killed in South America, I've always had a hard time with. Looking at the evidence, it's hard for me to believe that that Butch and Sundance would allow themselves to be cornered and be killed, or not, at least be cornered to where they were surrounded by only 2 or 4 different policemen, and would, out of character of Butch Cassidy, panic and based off some superficial wounds, go ahead and have a suicide pact where they would, supposedly Butch killed Sundance, and then with his last bullet killed himself. And to me, that's completely out of character for Butch Cassidy, for one that was one known to have used his head to get out of tough situations.
The 2 men were buried in the San Vicente cemetery. Carlos Pero was asked to identify the robbers. The bodies were exhumed shortly after burial. Pero identified the dead outlaws as the ones who had robbed him. The names of the bandits could not be confirmed. A team led by forensic anthropologist Clyde Snow attempted to exhume the bodies of the dead outlaws in 1991. The gravesite was identified by local legend to be that of the outlaws. it actually held the body of a German miner. Daniel Buck and Ann Meadows believe Butch and Sundance are buried somewhere in the San Vicente Cemetery.
I'm convinced that Butch and Sundance are buried in the San Vicente Cemetery. The problem is that so are hundreds and hundreds of other people, and they're buried on top of each other, and old graves are disturbed, and their graves were never marked, so it's impossible to know where. Without digging up all of the graves in the whole cemetery, we can't find them.
Butch's sister Lula wrote of Butch coming back to visit the family in 1925. This was 17 years after the shootout at San Vicente.
My great-grandmother Lula was an honest person. She was very religious. Her Mormon religion was important to her, and telling the truth was very important. And I personally believe that she told the truth when she told of Butch coming back. I don't think she had anything to gain by telling that he was killed in South America or if he came back. Either way, she wouldn't have benefited from it.
Lula wrote of a black Ford pulling up to the Circleville homestead. In it was Robert Leroy Parker. Other Parker family members had differing opinions and versions of what happened to Butch. Bill Bettinson tells of a family secret.
After Butch Cassidy's visit with the family in Circleville in 1925, their father, Maximilian, had the family make a family pact that they wouldn't talk about his visit to anybody. And they maintained correspondence with Butch until 1937 when he passed away.
I think Lula sincerely believed that Butch came back, and that when she was writing her book, she thought, well, I'll just embroider a little bit and say he came to visit the family. It's possible that some other relative came to visit the family, and years later, in her mind, it had become Butch.
Josie Bassett and several others also told of seeing Butch Cassidy in later years. Josie said Butch and Elsie Lay visited her on 2 occasions after the South America shootout. Harv Murdoch is Elsie Lay's grandson. He spoke with Josie Bassett about Butch's return.
Josie's sense of humor was very, very keen, and her memory was also very keen. She told me of things that happened in her lifetime, and her credibility, as far as I'm concerned, is 100%.
Complicating the story were imposters roaming the West who claimed to be Butch Cassidy. Some who told truthful stories of seeing Butch may have been fooled.
And so you have a lot of people who sincerely believe that they had met Butch, and a lot of people thought that he had come back, but I don't believe he did.
Some legends die hard. Will Carver was killed by a sheriff in Texas in April 1901. Ben Kilpatrick was killed while robbing a train in 1912. Elsie Lay was released from prison in January 1906. He remarried and went straight. Elsie Lay died in 1934. The time of the Wild Bunch was relatively short. It lasted mostly from 1896 to 1901. The gang wasn't well known as the Wild Bunch until 1902. The name came from Pinkerton Detective Agency reports. What happened to Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid? It can't be said with absolute certainty. Daniel Buck and Ann Meadows have found revealing new evidence. Santiago Lowe was a guest at the Hotel Terminus in Tupiza, Bolivia, before the Aramayo robbery. The report was in a Tupiza newspaper dated November 4th, 1908. Lowe is a known Butch Cassidy alias. If Santiago Lowe was indeed Butch Cassidy, it places him in Tupiza, near the Aramayo robbery, at the right time. Many historians believe Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid were the 2 bandits who died in Bolivia. They believe Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid lie in unmarked graves in the lonely, windswept village of San Vicente, Bolivia. It's a story that refuses to die.
To learn more about Butch Cassidy and the Outlaw Trail, visit KUED online at kued.org.